this is the Yosemite Dome. I have been there. I have been in the presence of this mountain. I have looked up at it. I recommend it for anyone who wants to go on a fun like sightseeing activity. The Sierra Mountain chain is just beautiful, beautiful. So I'm sure what we're going to learn about is how colonizers ruined it all. Though that's usually how these articles go.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's kind of it.
So yeah, I guess we'll go from there. This is the myth of a wilderness without humans. And this gets to, I guess, what Orvis Cheval came in with, which is this idea that, like, a lot of people. I mean, I don't know if the article is going to get into this necessarily, but there is this idea of like nature and human beings are like separate from one another, and in this context, it was artificially made separate, I guess, to give this impression like the lands were uninhabited uh, by the indigenous people that live there.
Yeah, but also that like the ideal, state of the world is kind of without people, and
Yeah,
also like that conservation efforts should be like exclusionary efforts in an attempt to like keep people out, which is like
yeah,
wrong and bad and kind of like weird because especially with like forestry management stuff, like it always ends up being managed still. So it's like it is still very much like a fake landscape type of thing, especially like in, California or wherever where like they artificially clear the underbrush so that there aren't fires and whatever, and then that just like builds up over time to the point where now we have these huge forest fires because of poor management that kind of like, yeah, just takes out the like in that like weird attempt to keep humanity out but also still control it weirdly.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's a weird sense this the how you sort of set that up reminds me of this incident that happened relatively recent, which was this geologist professor or geography professor. Now I can't remember. She wrote an article in a peer-reviewed paper or journal, sorry, that was I think it was titled "Feminist" or "Feminist Glaciology" or something to do with feminism and with glaciers, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people on the kind of like right wing, especially like the James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian types who are like anti CRT and think that postmodernism is taking over everything, like collectively shat their pants over this article being written. And when you read it, it made sense because what the article was trying to reflect on was the fact that like there are communities of people that live at the base of glaciers and they interact with the glaciers in various ways and they're sort of like natural recession and growth, and climate change is like disrupting that, and how that like impacts people's interactions with the glaciers, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet everyone was like feminism and glaciology, and it's like no, it could, like, yes, like the idea in their head is sort of like glaciers are these like objects that need to be studied of themselves. It's like trying to think outside of that, going how do glaciers interact with human beings, and then all of a sudden you're crossing some sort of boundary that needs to be kept separate or something. It's like weird the aversion that people have to that.
Yeah. On a very similar note to that, I finished, I think, a month or two ago, a book called A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None by Catherine Youssef. That is basically like, it's a racial critique of geological notions of the Anthropocene. Like, and it specifically focuses on the study of geology, where it's like, where are these, you know, largely like how land is split up into this kind of like productive and unproductive sense, and like how the like various borders are created of the Anthropocene. Like one of the big ones is kind of like the so-called Columbian Exchange, in which Eurasia and Africa got like, you know, some of the best foods that we now enjoy, and the Americas got genocide and everything stripped from them type of thing. Um, but so choosing that date kind of automatically is just like oh yeah, well, oops, some things happened, or like there's various dates that place it within like the Industrial Revolution, or place it within like the 1950s or 40s with the nuclear bomb tests. And it's like, how those sorts of choices play into the dehumanization of specifically Black and Indigenous people. And like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like I'm very surprised that that one didn't get that sort of like people going crazy on Twitter about it, because I think it only came out like 2019 or 2020.
Well,
Um,
the only reason people
or
went after
2018, I
the
guess.
glacier thing is because there was this Twitter account that I can't even remember what the hell the Twitter account was, but it was like it just read the abstracts of various papers and would tweet them, and like it
Oh.
was like it was a account that right wingers like followed because it was to laugh at like the kind of like abstracts that were coming out of academia, and so it
Mhm.
just quoted the abstract of this papers. Yes, a new real peer review. Thank you, Elron. Uh, it just quoted the abstract of it as like I we're studying feminism in the light of glaciers, blah blah blah, and then they're like, ha 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 ha, ha. Like it literally was just that. So maybe it being a book makes it harder for for them to pick up in a quick little tweet thing, you know. As
Yeah,
for
it's
sorry, you
sorry.
finish your thought.
I don't know, like so much Twitter shit just sucks. It's just
Yeah,
and just reading Elrond's comment that I don't honestly understand, but
yeah.
sure.
I'm guessing the person who moderated the Twitter account, OK Ultra, kind of a fucking moron, clearly took baseline psych but has no actual applied knowledge. Makes sense. As for your comments earlier, Orbis Cheval, I'm not sure why there aren't a ton of pop anthropologists. The only thing I can think of off the top of my head is there was a lot of scandals that came out of anthropology early on that made it, I think, let me think of how I'm trying to phrase this. Like you had a lot of people who were anthropologists that like spoke for a lot of indigenous communities, and you had various theories, and it kind of like exposed a lot of like racism and like other shit in there that I find like it could be that they're like worried about overstating their claims in the public again. And it kind of like drifted into the background. I don't
I
know if that's
think
necessarily true, but like I'm wondering if that's why there's not that many.
um the I'll give you one guess actually on who the largest employer of anthropologists is.
Mining companies.
US Army.
All right.
Even worse, right?
Yeah.
So that's where they are. They're helping the military intervene places and making sure that they at least, have some cultural sensitivity while murdering them.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, granted, that's not
Or
going to be
they're just
all
like
anthropologists,
sitting in
but yeah.
universities.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I just know that like a lot of the nature nurture stuff came out of anthropology, and there was lots of like fighting with like certain tribes being like inherently or innately like more aggressive, and uh
Hmm.
and a lot of the stuff that came out of that, you had to deal with the fact that there were certain people who were racist and thought that like non-whites were like not as good in various capacities and like all that shit. And so years and years of contending with that, like I don't know, I don't think it did the field any justice. Not to say that,
Yeah.
that there couldn't be good anthropologists out of that, but I mean, if they're also being hired for the military to further colonization,
Yeah.
maybe nothing has
Um,
changed, you know?
the It's really interesting to read, or to think of, like, Ursula K. Le Guin as, like, she's the daughter of, like, a really huge anthropologist and, like, one of the kind of, like, founders of modern anthropology, and reading it from that perspective of a kind of, like, a fictional critique of anthropology almost, where it's like a lot of her books are about, an outsider arriving at a planet and just kind of like observing and eventually realizing that like there is no way to be apart from everything that's going on around them, because to be apart from it is kind of just like to separate yourself off from the other people's humanity, because you're kind of like sitting in your own perspective as like, I am human, these people are subjects, type of thing. um and like, kind of just like reading it in that way, especially for example like Left Hand of Darkness, where it's like, you know dude shows up to a world that has a completely different gender system and like completely different like means of like sexual reproduction, and sees himself as entirely apart until suddenly he's actually like affected by shit that is happening there and has to like kind of become human with those people that he's been kind of studying with, or studying this whole time. And I don't know, just like that notion of like having to separate yourself in order to study it, I think also applies to the article. Boom. Transition.
Uh, yeah, I just have one little thing to add to what you said, which I think the only PhD student or master's student, I think at the time, that I knew studying anthropology was studying gender, and you know, especially within our own uh, area, the culture surrounding
Mhm.
gender norms and stuff like this. So like work gets done on that, but yeah, let's take a look at this article. The myth of a wilderness without humans. For over a century, conflicting views of wild nature created a rift between indigenous people and misguided conservationists. Oh, you misguided conservationists. And my guess is there's going to be some indigenous names that I will pronounce poorly, and I apologize ahead of time because I mispronounced everything. It's just how it goes. Oh, I know this person's name, Rebecca Solnit. One way to guarantee a conservation without a conclusion is to ask a group of people what nature is. One way to guarantee a conversation without a conclusion is to ask a group of people what nature is. No, I agree with that. Again, I stipulate, I think nature is meaningless. I don't think nature has a lot of meaning to it. A lot of people seem to think that it does. And I always joked that I was going to write a book called Against Nature and argue how
Nature
it's
is all things.
well, it's either everything or and if it is everything, then it's meaningless. And why do we have it around? Right? I mean, that, like, nature works if you contrast it with like the supernatural. But if like you're like me and the supernatural doesn't exist, then like nature just is everything. And then what use is nature now? You know. And the other
Yeah.
distinguishing point that you would have is if you say something like natural as opposed to like synthetic or something like this. But I also think that that becomes meaningless in the same way that like the only reason that's a distinction is because we like to think of ourselves as special. For example, beavers create things, right? Yet everyone thinks of a beaver dam as natural, and yet we think of like skyscrapers as somehow being like not natural, even though beaver dams are to beavers like skyscrapers are to us. You know, it's
Yeah. And often, like, because when you said synthetic, to me, what came to mind was like fabrics, because
yeah,
my mother is a textile artist, so
yeah.
everything relates to fabrics. Um,
I was just
and
thinking anything that
it's
humans create, but yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, I got when you were explaining more, but just from where my brain jumped off to, it's kind of like, they the labeling of it as a synthetic is kind of a means of abstracting it from what it actually is, which is plastic. Like,
Yeah.
we don't want to call it a plastic fiber. We want to call it synthetic because that sounds nicer and less polluting. Like,
I suppose,
like
like,
it's
I don't know.
yeah,
I don't
like
know if synthetic is far enough removed because I think for some people it still sounds artificial. Like,
yeah,
yeah,
but it doesn't sound like it's made out of oil type of thing,
yeah, yeah.
right? Like, and that's a like big thing that happened was like the main reason that hemp and hemp fiber got banned in the US was because it was more competitive than nylon, which is a
Petroleum based.
synthetic.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's a plastic fabric. And so they banned hemp in order to basically like, you know, make it so that nylon could be a thing, and that continues, the extractivist notion of like oil and whatever bullshit. Like it's just a means of like doing economic control.
Tim says since chemically or thermally ruining the structure of proteins is called denaturing, we can safely conclude that nature is the property of proteins being boned and structured in their neutral state. All right. And apparently Cherokee Chocolate's been watching too much Dave Rubin. Uh, listen,
True.
my brain has never stopped taking on high level ideas, right? Bonded, not boned. Okay, that's why I was confused. I was like, boned. I thought, Tim is getting sexual with these proteins now.
Ron said, thinking about the time I got into a shouting argument with a philosophy student who wanted to argue pants are unnatural.
Was it Homer
Yes,
Simpson?
I'm on the philosophy student's side.
Oh, I'm getting
Everything else is nature. Pants are not.
speaking of unnatural, I'm getting a I'm not gonna answer it. It's a no, it's
Oh,
a phone call from a robot.
okay.
It's either gonna be like you want a cruise, or it's gonna be the one that's like there's a warrant out for your arrest. I don't know if you've ever received those ones, but
Yeah. The CRA has hired mercenaries,
yeah.
and they will deport you.
Anyways, so we got past the Rebecca Solnit quote. I guess we can get to the
Into the first paragraph.
In the course of preserving the commons for all of the people, a frequently stated mission of national parks and protected areas, one class or culture of people, one philosophy of nature, one worldview, and one creation myth has almost always been preferred over all others. These favored ideas and impressions are at some point expressed in art, and it is through art that our earliest preconceptions and fantasies about nature are formed. They and their friends who sought to preserve an idealized version of nature called it wilderness, a place that humans had explored but never altered, exalted but never touched. It was the beginning of a myth, a fiction that would gradually spread around the world and for a century or more drive the conservation agenda of mankind. I guess I should state this is an excerpt from the book Conservation Refugees, which is by Mark Dowie. The mystique of Yosemite, for example, was largely created by photographers like Charles Leander Weed, Carlton Watkins, Ansel Adams, and Edward Weston, all of whose magnificent images of the place are completely bereft of humanity or any sign of it having been there. Here, they said, and they all knew better, is an untrammeled landscape, virgin and pristine, not a boot print to be seen, not a Hogan or teepee in sight. What's a Hogan?
I don't know.
Here in this wild place, one may seek and find complete peace. And now, to be honest, sadly, it's a tourist trap. Like, I mean, even now, like, it's not untrammeled. I have to say, like, when I went there to Yosemite, all the roadways leading up to it jam packed full of people. All the people who are out on the thing. I mean, they might not be walking in the woods, but they're all on the viewing platforms. Like, people are all around. Yeah, we could just ban that person.
Yep, they're gone.
Not today.
We're Republican up the raw.
Yeah.
Um, a hogan is a Navajo dwelling, usually made of logs and mud, with a door traditionally facing east. And Yosemite is kind of where
Okay.
it's adjacent to the Navajo lands, I believe.
Yeah, it would be nearby. I don't know where the Navajo lands like extend, so
Yeah.
I know where they are now, and it's Yosemite is north, I think of that.
I mean, because they're the Dene, and they went like there are Dene in like Saskatchewan and Alberta and like those areas, so they did kind of
Well, it looks like
range
here,
very far north.
yeah, it looks like here they're talking about the Miwok people. I don't know if I'm
Yeah.
pronouncing that right. They all knew better, the betrayers of wilderness. In fact, Adams assiduously avoided photographing any of the local Miwok who were rarely out of the sight of his sight as he worked Yosemite Valley. He filled thousands of human-free negatives with land he knew the Miwok had tended for at least 4,000 years. And he knew that the Miwok had been forcibly evicted from Yosemite Valley, as other natives would later be from national parks yet to be created, all in the putative interest of protecting nature from human disturbance. One can be fairly certain that Weed, Watkins, Adam, and Weston had all at one time in their lives read George Perkins Marsh's 1864 classic Man and Nature, and recalled Marsh arguing passionately for the preservation of wild virgin nature. Virgin. Which he said was justified as much for artistic reasons as for any other. Marsh also believed that the destruction of the natural world threatened the very existence of humanity. We know that Muir read Marsh, and so did Teddy Roosevelt. They both say so in their journals and memoirs. So when the topic of a park in Yosemite came up, Muir and Roosevelt were, so to speak, on the same page. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing Muir right.
I think that sounds right. Weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing is like some of the parks being reclaimed and giving back to indigenous people today, which is really interesting. Not in America, but or at least I think that some of that's happening in California. I think
Yeah,
I
I
remember
think
reading an article about that.
yeah, I think so. And I think some like a decent amount in like Latin America and stuff like that.
I mean, Ontario gave back Ipperwash after we killed someone.
Uh-huh. Yep.
Hooray!
Ooh.
Oh my god, Tim. I'm eating dry protein powder. Is this good? No. Is it natural? Yes. Well, yeah, sure. It's about trying to own more shit. They want to pretend it's untouched and kept untouched. In this case, I don't think the main driving force is a kind of ownership when it comes to like parks. I think it stems from, again, I don't know if it like I don't know if it's just misogyny, but it's this like idea that there's like a pureness or like he used the word virginal, like they're untouched. It's
Yeah.
it's
I mean,
yeah.
it is about property relations though, right? Like it is about removing indigenous people in order to assimilate them and everything too. Like
Yeah,
and then
I
also
guess it's the removal of them in order for you to like better appreciate this thing right. So it's not necessarily like taking it property to like mine or like other shit. It's so
but
that
it
others
is.
can come and appreciate the beauty. I mean, I guess maybe it
Like
is in some cases.
yeah, like it's the the struggle of the over the Black Hills that the US government waged against the Oseti-Sakoan in kind of like in some respects in the name of conservation, and then in other respects being like, we know there's good minerals underneath those hills
Yeah,
and we want them. So like, yeah, like it's always about property at the end of the day. Like there is no kind of separation from that because even though it's like, oh, keeping it pristine, it's like, okay, one, pristine for who? And two, like the notion of like, clearing the land and having it, just under like this empty tenure is still a way for the government to gain access to it and control over it.
I
And
guess.
then, piecemeal give it to mining companies in the
Yeah.
end.
Well, I know that has happened, especially like recent, uh, especially since the 1900s going forward. But like, uh, I mean, the conservation trend of the 1800s and early 1900s, that like, I guess the part that I was trying to like differentiate was the difference between uh, private ownership of this stuff and of like a kind of public ownership, which differs within within like the park system, right? But then, of course, especially this was like a later phenomenon, especially of like selling off the parkland for other like extraction purposes and whatnot, which I think even
Mm.
Trump tried to do in certain cases as well. But
I think the mistake there is kind of like seeing state ownership as public ownership. Like if it's
yeah,
state owned, that is still a private owner type of thing. Like as much as like, it is kind of like accepting the like myth of citizenship where it's like, oh, we are supposedly all, you know, shareholders or whatever the fuck in this like so-called
yeah.
public when like really no, like it's still a private owner. It's just kind of like
But I think
we
that
occasionally get to vote for the people who are going to displace others. Like,
but I think that like that the difference still matters in that like I think you're right, but it's motivated by a different impulse. You know what I mean? It's this like it's more of like a it's like like you know how like people talk about like benevolent sexism. This is like it's like a more benevolent impulse as opposed to like the kind of like greedy impulse of like I want this so I can get this out of it kind of like idea. This is like it's like this idea that they conceive they're doing it for the greater good kind of thing, right? Now I happen to think that they're wrong for all the reasons that you pointed out. I just think like it does seem to me that the impulse here for like creating like quote unquote public parks is different than the person who just wants to like capitalize on land for like their own wealth reasons, right?
see, I think that it's like yeah, kind of in the like quote unquote benevolent notion, but I think that that's kind of like, it is to Indian removal under like Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears what like residential schools are to like direct killing type of thing,
Yeah,
where it's like it's a benevolent genocide. It's a like a
yeah.
civilizing genocide, so to speak.
No, and
Um,
like I obviously think that it's all shitty all the way down, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
it's just that
I just
I think framing it in that way, like for me, only like you're able to differentiate how like different sets of motivations can still lead to like shitty things, right? Because I think a lot of people would think that this benevolent impulse is like generally a good thing, you know? And it's like in this case, no, you know.
yeah, I don't think that it's like it's still about, property and ownership though. Is kind of like I think the key thing that I was trying to push was that like
Yeah, no,
it isn't separable from that part. Yeah.
I agree. My clarification was only because like I went that I recharacterized what I was trying to say first after I
Yeah.
fucked up with the property thing in the first place. So, anyways, dueling sciences. Natural science is just one way of understanding nature. Bill Adams, Cambridge University. The Yosemite model of conservation, which still expresses itself in a fairly consistent form, has sparked a worldwide conflict between two powerful scientific disciplines, anthropology and conservation biology. These two august sciences remain at odds with one another over how best to conserve and protect biological and cultural diversity. And perhaps more perplexing, how best to define two of most semantically tortured terms in both their fields, nature and wilderness. Cultural anthropologists spend years living in what many of us would call the wild, studying the languages, mores, and traditions of what many of us would call primitive peoples. Again, see, this is what I was getting at with anthropology.
Yeah.
A lot of issues in that discipline. Eventually, the anthropologists come to understand the complex native cultures that kept keep remote communities thriving without importing much from outside their immediate homeland. We do not ask if indigenous peoples are allies of conservation or what sort of nature they protect, write Paige West and Dan Brockington, two anthropologists who have spent most of their careers researching the impact of protected areas on indigenous cultures. Instead, we draw attention to the ways in which protected areas become instrumental in shaping battles over identity, residence, and resource use. Their experience has convinced them that the best way to protect a thriving natural ecosystem is to leave those communities pretty much alone, where and as they are, doing what they've done so well for so many generations, culturing a healthy landscape, or what development experts would call living sustainably. I mean, even this seems like weird as well.
It does. And I think that that's part of it, right? Where it's
Yeah,
like it's coming from this kind of like academic outside perspective, kind of still in some respects, like, I don't know, like, I don't think fetishizing is quite the right word, but that's the only one that I can think of where it's just kind of like ooh, like these fancy magical indigenous people,
yeah.
these
It's the
so-called
I've heard it referred
primitive.
to as the myth of the noble savage,
Yeah,
which
yeah, like
still
it's
essentializes them as these kind of like, as you put it, like magical beings, where it's like we're all human, you know?
yeah, and it's like it's difficult because in some respects, like that's what this is trying to critique
Yeah,
because like, it is being like they're so-called living sustainably, or it's saying like what many people might think of as like quote unquote primitive peoples or whatever else, where it's like it's attempting a critique from within side that same system, but sometimes it doesn't work out that great.
yeah. I think the one thing that you can say is for people who live in an area, they could, like, for example, I think we've discussed the like removing of brush to like prevent forest fires. So I think like
Hmm.
there's something to say about the experience of living in a particular area, right? I mean, like, and you could sort of say that without like needing to say that like somehow they will magically always make things sustainable because they're liable, just like we are currently destroying the entire planet. Like, give humans enough time and space, and we will fuck some shit up. Wildlife biologists also spend much of their careers in remote natural settings, but tend to prefer landscapes void of human hunters, gatherers, pastoral nomadics, or rotational farmers. They find anthropologists somewhat romantic about indigenous cultures. Okay, this is exactly what we're getting at too.
Yeah.
Particularly tribes that have become partly assimilated and modernized, which generally means the tribes are in possession of environmentally destructive technologies such as shotguns, chainsaws, and motorized vehicles, conveniences that Western naturalists know from their own civilization's experience can wreak havoc on healthy ecosystems. They're so in touch with the earth, they don't have the internal diversity of interests and drive for personal comforts that trade off against environmental. I'm not sure what you're quoting. Oh, maybe that's from an earlier thing, Tim. Sorry. Look at you. Look at the
No,
chat just talking to
I think
themselves.
he's making up a quote as like a critique of what this person has been doing.
These two disciplines are also at odds over what they mean by nature and the degree to which humanity is part of it. And they have a different sense of wilderness, or wildness, and wilderness. It is in this regard that one is more likely to hear anthropologists calling naturalists romantic. Listening to this exchange of insults, one might conclude one is witnessing a clash of romantic tendencies. William Cronin, an environmental historian at the University of Wisconsin, has spent much of his intellectual career grappling with these conflicts. His thinking on the subject eventually came together in 1995 with publication of a widely read and controversial essay titled The Trouble with Wilderness: Getting Back to the Wrong Nature. The wrong nature. The time has come to rethink wilderness, Cronin begins his essay. He goes on to challenge the widely held and decidedly romantic notion of environmentalists that wilderness stands at the last remaining place where civilization, that all too human disease, has not fully infected the earth. Yeah. That concept, Cronin believes, gives credence to the illusion that we can somehow wipe clean the slate of our past and return to the tabula rasa that supposedly existed before we began to leave our marks on the world. Yep. I mean, this is also why I find myself opposed to certain forms of, I guess, anarcho-primitivism or even like Ludditism. It's just like, I don't think there is a pristine state that existed before all of this, you know. Gotta find how to deal with what we have. That fiction which Cronin believes is based on a profound misunderstanding of nature and her place in it creates a force that is antagonistic to conservation. The myth of wilderness, he writes, is that we can somehow leave nature untouched by our passage. He goes on to challenge the shop-worn and often misunderstood shibboleth of Henry David Thoreau that in wilderness is the preservation of the world. Cronin concludes, the more one knows of its peculiar history, the more one realizes that wilderness is not quite what it seems. Far from being one place on earth that stands apart from humanity, it is quite profoundly a human creation. Indeed, the creation of very particular human cultures at very particular moments in human history. It is not a pristine sanctuary, excuse me, where the last remnant of an untouched, endangered, but still transcendent nature can for at least a little while longer be encountered without the contaminating taint of civilization. The taint of civilization.
Space between stuff and other stuff.
Instead, it is a product of that civilization. I wasn't going to comment on that way. I mean, I even think, yeah, I'm not going to speak ahead because he's probably going to get to it, but I think I will agree with a lot of this Cronin person. Cronin?
Cronin? I don't know.
Yeah. These are fighting words to a civilization that has set millions of square miles of valuable land aside as wilderness. Passed national law, the 1964 Wilderness Act, to both define and protect wilderness, and still supports a dozen or so well-heeled national organizations to lobby for more wilderness set-asides, and convince the public that figuratively walling off large expanses of unoccupied land is the only way to preserve nature and biological diversity. But how natural is wilderness? To Cronin, not as natural as it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Wilderness hides its unnaturalness behind a mask that is all the more beguiling because it seems so natural, he says. By glorifying pristine landscapes, which exist only in the imaginations of romantics, Western conservationists divert attention from the places where people live and the choices they make every day that do true damage to the natural world of which they are a part. So the removal of Aboriginal human beings from their homeland to create a commodified wilderness is a deliberate charade, a culturally constructed neo-Edenic narrative played out for the enchantment of weary human urbanites yearning for the open frontier that their ancestors discovered, then tamed, a place to absorb the sounds and images of virgin nature and forget for a moment the thoroughly unnatural lives they lead. It's interesting because now some like virginal already sort of fills it in, but like the religious like notions of like neo-Edenic, so like a new Eden, but then there's also. Sorry, go on.
No, you finish and then I'll go into what I want to go.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that like part of that stems, I think, from this idea of like. There is a sense in which there's some people I know that like you would call like nature lovers that do believe that somehow like city and like anything that human beings like this house, the computer, like all these things are like quote unquote unnatural and therefore like bad. And like I think there's real reasons in which these things can variously be harmful to us, you know. lead paint in the walls, or used they have been, uh, you know, uh, being constantly on your phone, and like all this stuff, right? So I feel like a lot of people, when it comes to like uh existing in our current society and the stresses that surround that, this like perception that like there was this better state that we can somehow return to is like appealing to them, even though it really like doesn't exist, and never existed.
Yeah. Um, and how notions of the idyllic past and returning to a frontier lifestyle, something something, yeah, no, manifest destiny, etc. Fascism, Volkish ideology type of shit.
Yeah,
But also like, are the whole like Neo Eden stuff, like that ties into the earliest histories of Europeans arriving on this continent. Like they arrived and were like, wow, this is a real Eden. There's berries everywhere. There's animals that are so abundant that we can just like hunt and eat. And, these trees are dropping edible nuts and fruit and whatever else. And it's like, whoa, it's amazing that these, you know, rude words for indigenous people just like live this way and like wow, they're so lucky to live in this new Eden and blah 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 blah. And it's like, no, that was fucking created.
yeah,
Like, and it ties into like the whole Thanksgiving and like the Thoreau stuff and like everything like that, where it's like talking about like, oh, when they arrived on this continent, like everything was so empty but so lush, and you know, there was food everywhere, and it was a land of abundance and plenty and whatever other bullshit. And it's like, no, that is because it was cleared of the people who tended to it for thousands of years.
yeah,
And, that's at the end of the day, like where this sort of thing comes from is like as more and more people arrived from Europe and the forest disappeared and like the animals were hunted down and everything else happened, you know, the Europeans who had been there longer kind of like realized what had been lost. They realized that something was wrong. And so, they try to go back to this Eden that they supposedly discovered when they arrived here. And it's like, maybe you don't get that by repeating the exact same things that your ancestors did, or that like the not necessarily literal ancestors, but the predecessors in the colonial system. And like that's what this is. And it's the same thing like with Mormons, where it's like, oh, indigenous people are like the cursed lost tribes of Israel who have dark skin because they're cursed by God. And so they live in a quote unquote natural state and whatever else. And the only way to save them is to civilize them and to, take control of their territories and everything. And it's like, and, manifest destiny, of course, and like everything else, just like it all ties into this idea of like creating a new Eden and creating a new kind of like holy land on this continent almost. And that's the basis of the United States. Um,
well,
Fuck Mormons. Yeah, Tim, you're right. Uh,
are we anti-Mormon here? I thought Joseph Smith was right.
True.
He read those
Joseph
tablets
Smith
out of
was
a
the
hat.
most recent. Yeah, the ancient Egyptian ones that he found buried
Did you
in
did you read
Utah.
gold tablets out of a hat? No, you didn't. All right, Vienna.
True. No, I'm
Checkmate.
not. I'm not claiming I did. If I were to claim that, it might be bullshit. But whatever. Um, Quakers have the capacity to be cool. That's my answer. Um, some of them, like they still did really participate in colonialism. They still really did like profit off of the destruction of indigenous people, even if they were like, we're not going to take guns and scalp them, but we'll let other people do it. And settle their lands after. But also, Edward Said was a Quaker, so who's to say, really? Um,
I just think too there's an element in which I think, I mean, there's one thing to say about the span of human history and the relationships we have to this like idea of like this pristine land and how to civilize things and stuff like this. Where it's like today I find like there is a weird, like a similar impulse, but it's slightly different. And I think part of that is because, especially if you live in a city, there's not a lot of places where you can just sit there and contemplate with like most humans not being around and there's trees and birds and whatnot, right? And I find like when people like experience that, there's like this sense in which this is how it should always be. Isn't this wonderful, etc., etc. Where like I do find that like people underestimate the hardship that exists if like you were to just like live without our technology or whatever, like just exist in this like Edenic sense, which is like even just in the base of like doing like home gardening that I do, where you realize like it is a lot of fucking work just for the few plants that I maintain, and to deal with the fact of like pests are constantly trying to eat it, and like you know what I mean. uh
Yeah.
I think people just like it's this warped sense that they just feel like that there's something that we've lost that we have to go back to, and it's like I don't know, if you went back to it, I think a lot of people would be again complaining even about that. Like I just think part of it is that hardship exists everywhere is I guess what I'm trying to get at. You know, that there's a sense in which people imagine that things would just be easier, you know.
I think that like, because the reason, like one of the big things that like capitalism does is kind of like, it helps create that sort of like man-nature divide, and by doing so, it alienates humanity from the rest of existence type of thing. Like we are our own separate sphere, and so everything else is not us. And it's like, and in that respect, it's like, yeah, there has been like a lot lost. We don't, we do have a very fucked up relationship with the rest of the world. And, I do think that people can very understandably like feel that, like they know something is wrong. And John Holloway, who's a Marxist, I believe he lives in Cuba, and he's like one of the main theoreticians of a trend called open Marxism. Um, he has like this notion of a thing called the scream that is basically like, it's this internal wrongness that people feel like, and that's sort of like people's first, understandings that this world is just unbelievably fucked up. And like, there is nothing on some level that you can do but scream.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
and I think that this apply like I think he
which
mostly
is
meant
our
it to
Twitch
apply
stream.
to the kind of like economic relations and like that kind of thing, but also, and maybe more human social relations, but like it applies to basically everything. Like people realize that something is wrong. People know that everything is fucked up. And sometimes they just don't have a good answer to it.
Yeah.
There is no like, and so their answers are like, oh, we need to return to nature, or we need to like, we need Lebensraum, or we need, like all of these other things that have just like led to horrific events throughout world history. But it's like, you can feel it inside you. Like, something's
Yeah.
wrong and that it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of just stuck with that until, you come up with something that gives you some sort of answer to that. And unfortunately, that often ends up being something even more fucked up. But that also doesn't have to be true.
Yeah, no, I guess like you're highlighting some ways in which that impulse doesn't necessarily have to be like it comes from a real place, in that there really is
Yeah.
something that's fucked up. And I get that. It's just it's again just how that manifests itself, and whether it manifests itself in good or bad ways, you know. And sometimes, like when it comes to certain people, it does this, like some, like Tim even mentioned, like some of the organic industry stuff like this, and it does sort of like manifest itself in weird ways like that, in that a lot of industrial scale organic farming is no better than like conventional farming, but and that's not to say that organic farming is necessarily bad. Like there's a difference as well between like organic farming in your backyard and like industrial scale organic farming, right? But the point is that like this presumption that somehow, because this is like more natural or like more pristine, it's like involves less of certain things as opposed to other things, that somehow it's like better. And it's not always the case that it is better, you know. But because we have these impulses that like, yeah, something is fucked up, maybe we do need to change some things, we get like sucked, especially certain people have this idea that like there is a pristine nature to go to. They get sucked into these grifting opportunities often by other people that are trying to sell them this pristineness, you know.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of see it in like even like, you know, anti-vax or like those types of
yeah,
people where it's like, you know, there is the impulse of like, yeah, the medical system is pretty fucked up,
yeah.
but the conclusions they draw off of that are
That was
also even more fucked up.
It was like dealing with that guy from last stream, you know, where you have questions of like, but I thought you were anti big pharma. And it's like, well, yeah, I am anti big pharma, but like, there's nuance here. So, yeah. But it's like, yeah, that like things are fucked up, but it's like, how do you navigate that? Can be difficult for people. I fully
Yeah.
appreciate that. Anyways, I also noticed that, Tim, you left a comment I wanted to say that I agreed with. And it kind of hit on some of the things that I was saying. It was can I just say, as an evolution excuse me, can I just say, as an evolution scientist, the thing that really drives me nuts are people who claim to be really interested in and love nature, simply do not comprehend the monstrous and wasteful Malthusian struggle for agonizing existence that suffuses every layer of every ecosystem. Yep. Lots of creatures killing lots of creatures within those systems, which is fine and dandy, so long as the end victim is the mosquitoes. Hate the mosquitoes. So what is wild? What counts as wilderness is not determined by the absence of people, but by the relationship between people and place. Jack Turner, philosopher. On several occasions during my research, an interview would be brought to a dead stop after I included the word wild or wilderness in a question. The word simply didn't exist in the dialect of the person I was interviewing. My interpreter would stare at me and wait for a better question. When I tried to explain what I meant by wild to Bertha Petequan, an Ojibwe woman in northern Canada whose daughter was interpreting, she burst out laughing and said the only place she has ever seen what she thought I was describing as wild was a street corner outside the bus station in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
I love that so fucking much. Like,
that's so true. It is so true. I know what she means, you know?
Yeah.
I totally get it. Oh, Winnipeg. I've never heard anyone say anything good about Winnipeg. Oh my god. Oh my god. In Alaska, Patricia Cochrane, a Yupik native scientist, told me, we have no word for wilderness. What you call wilderness, we call our backyard. To us, none of Alaska is wilderness as defined by the 1964 Wilderness Act, a place without people. We are deeply insulted by that concept, as we are by the whole idea of wilderness designation that too often excludes Native Alaskans from ancestral lands. Yupiks also Yupiks also have no word for biodiversity. Its closest approximation means food, and the Autumn Pima word for wilderness is etymologically related to the term for health, wholeness, and liveliness. Interesting that no word for biodiversity.
I mean, it makes sense. Like, English had no use for the word biodiversity until
Relatively recent.
probably the last like 50 years. Like, so much of this is just like a social invention that we've decided to
No,
like acknowledge as legitimate.
I was working on a project that I didn't finish when I dropped out of my PhD on the gut biome and like bacterial biodiversity within your gut biome. And like what counts as a biome, like how much diversity is necessary in order for it to be called a biome, and all these kind of like philosophical distinguishes of where scientists are drawing the lines on these things. And
Yeah.
it gets to a point that like there is no hard and fast rule. Like people are just drawing lines all over the place, you know? Because like in some sense, nature did not plan ahead that we were gonna need to like decide what amount of bacteria in the gut biome is like good versus bad, you know, or what type of bacteria. Like, and then you find out that like culture is different in the gut bacteria, and like this, and then it's like, well, we care about good health, but then it's like, but then there's different types of biodiversity within the gut that accounts for good health, and et cetera, right?
Yeah. Um, what was the book? It's edited by Anna Singh, who is like one of my favorite authors of like just any books. She wrote Mushroom at the End of the World, um, which is like a social history of the matsutake mushroom, and it's just like I fucking love that book. But it's a book called Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, and it has two sections. One is labeled ghosts, the other is labeled monsters, and ghosts are what have been lost, what has been destroyed, what is missing from this world, and then monsters is basically what we have created.
Yeah.
Um, and it's just like a collection of essays from just like a multidisciplinary standpoint of like biologists and anthropologists and ecologists and fucking just everybody. And like one of the essays is kind of about like questioning the notion of a quote unquote singular like human as itself an abstraction, where it's like, you know, we're pretending that we are just like one species when we wouldn't be alive without like our various bacterial biomes, but those are somehow like excluded from the notions of humanity despite making up us, right?
You know,
um
like that was part of my larger project was like
yeah, no, like it reminded
the
me a lot of
yeah,
that.
of like where do you draw the boundary between what is you and what isn't, and like I mean, like I even want to say that like probably now I would include a phone in the human phenotype. We're just all connected to it. Like I even get like everyone probably relates to this is like phantom phone syndrome where you feel your phone go off but it doesn't actually go off. You just like have the sensation and then you think your phone went off. Has that ever happened to you, Vienna?
um Yeah, and also like I often
Yeah.
have to like turn it over because my old phones used to like have a little flashy light on them when I got a notification. And I'll sometimes see that out of the corner of my eye if the phone's like screen is facing upwards. Um I definitely wouldn't go that far just because like it places a universalization on access to technology. Um
No, I'm just saying like it can get like for someone who uses a phone frequently, it gets incorporated in their schema like of what constitutes themselves kind of.
I suppose. Um Yeah, but also like just in terms of like not even like the things that are physically on us, but the fact that we like have a heat layer around us all the time. Um I was reading that one, oh fuck, it was Levantin, I don't know how to say his name.
Well,
The one
I
who
think it's Lewontin.
died recently. Yeah.
Richard
His
Lewontin?
book on yeah,
Yeah.
his book on biology is ideology. Um touched on like the like fact that mosquitoes have to be like specialized almost in order to like actually enter our heat layer, because it is kind of like its own atmosphere almost around us all the time. And it was just like something that I'd totally never thought of before. And it was just like a very like, oh yeah, like even in terms of like, so-called non-living things or whatever, like we have a like extended being kind of around us.
I mean, like, yeah, all these phenomena are fascinating. Like, even ecosystems are interesting to sort of like take apart, right? Which is that they interact and overlap with other ecosystems. And what counts as an ecosystem? Like, uh what do you need to like count the particular like species within a thing and they all count as an ecosystem? Can they share members with other ecosystems? Like, how do you appropriately do they end at like artificial boundaries, or do they end at like rivers and stuff? Like, how do you carve these things up, and it's all us who want to do the categorizing. You know what I mean? In some ways it's all just, we're all just atoms, yo. We're all just atoms.
True. And they don't touch.
That's why we can run through walls.
Yeah. Like the Flash.
Exclusive erotic sounds.
I don't know. I couldn't think of a better joke, which is why I didn't say it out loud.
All right. Jacob Malice, a Komani hunter from a section of the Kalahari that is now Gemsbach National Park, shares Cochrane's perspective on wilderness. The Kalahari is like a big farmyard, he says. It is not wilderness to us. We know every plant, animal, and insect, and know how to use them. No other people could ever know and love this farm like us. I never thought of the Stein Valley as a wilderness, remarks Ruby Dunstan, I don't know if I'll be able to pronounce that one, so I'm just going to avoid it.
Nilakapamux.
Okay, from Alberta. My dad used to say that's our pantry. Then some environmentalists declared it a wilderness and said no one was allowed inside because it was so fragile. So they put a fence around it, or maybe around themselves. The Tarahumara of Mexico also have no word or concept meaning wilderness. Land is granted the same love and affection as family. Ethno-ecologist Enrique Salmon, himself a Tarahumara, calls it kin-centric ecology. We are immersed in an environment where we are at equal standing with the rest of the world, he says. They are all kindred relations, the trees and rocks and bugs, and everything is in equal standing with the rest.
9.
Whoa!
9.
9 months. Thank you, Keffels, for the 9-month subscription. It was a little terrifying to hear a robot voice yell no in German at me, but since it was your 9th subscription, I guess all I can say is thank you. Thank you very much. And everyone should go follow Keffels. They are hilarious, and their stream is taken off. Is this a naughty word in German? Keffels, I can't speak German. I don't know. Oh yes. Look at Nom. Does that mean you're a subscriber of the Keffels, Nom? All the head patting. When wildness is conflated with wilderness, and wilderness with nature, and nature is seen as something separate and uninfluenced by human activity, perhaps it's time to examine real situations and test them against the semantics of modern conservation. Are Maasai cattle part of nature? Perhaps not today, but when they wandered through the open range by the thousands, tended by a few human herdsmen whose primary interest was to keep the biota healthy for their livestock and other wildlife, one might say they were wild. Certainly as wild as the springbok, eland, elephant, and buffalo that daily leave the open pasture to ravage Maasai farms for fodder. Why can't they still be nature? Why can't they not? Nam has a VAP in my chat, I think. So true, my chat shamed me for my foot fetish? Kevels has an awful audience base that's anti-feet. This must be some discourse on your stream that I missed recently. But I can confirm that I can't speak for my chat, but we are not against the foot fetishists. They are allowed to exist. We stand. Well, we will not shame you, Keffels.
Mm-hmm.
Your appreciation of feet is welcome here. All right. Well, if
Feet are friends, not food. No, that doesn't work.
I was gonna, not frenemies. I was trying to think of like some alliteration. I mean, for a foot fetishist, they might also be food, but you know, I'm not.
Yeah, I know that also is part of
the joke that I specified too much of. And who is nature? Nothing. Nothing is nature. We forget the reciprocity between the wild in nature and the wild in us. We are wild. Woo!
woohoo.
In one of the many conversations about nature, for some reason, because I know this was an article on conservation, every time I've seen the word conversation, I want to say conservation. When is nature? Nature is no time, nowhere.
Yeah,
No
fuck time.
In one of the many conversations about nature I have been part of over the past 3 years, I said to a man, an educated, erudite, and generous supporter of international conservation, whose view of nature differed considerably from my own, "You are nature." He looked at me and laughed nervously. I had not insulted him, he assured me. He just didn't appreciate the notion that he was part or product of a system that also created snails, kudzos, mules, earthquakes, grizzly bears, viruses, wildfires, and poison oak. Why would you be ashamed or not appreciate that?
Because he's rich and capitalism, etc., etc.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a controversial take here. I think there's something wrong with rich people.
For shame.
It turned out also that his younger sister had, years before, been badly mauled by a mountain lion. How many of us are dying of COVID right now? Well, how do you convince someone with that experience that he is kin with the lion? Perhaps you can't, I thought. But he seemed interested in continuing the conversation. Others joined in, and by the end of the evening he had accepted himself as an equal in the same creation with the lion that mauled his sister. A creation he was willing to call nature. A creation of which he was not a part, but a part.
I think that's one of those times where you're supposed to like pronounce the A differently. Who is not a part, but a part.
Yeah, no, but you see, I just left in a verbal space, right? So I said a part, but a part. See?
Sure. I didn't pick up on that at all, personally.
Well,
and
if you
I
went
was in
back and
fact
listened,
listening to you.
I snorted. I made sure it was in there. Don't worry. You can go back and
Okay.
listen.
I think in the future maybe you should snort between.
Oh my god. I'm having breathing issues today. Dear Lord. When is time? When is time? That is a good question. Rich people drool. Everyone is saying this. Yes. Apparently, rich person needed to have a quaint conversation in order to realize that he and the lion are both a part of nature. Somehow, this rich fucking man lived his whole life without putting two and two together. Jesus Christ. I guess this person is okay with capitalist Nazis and other Hoinemans?
And other. I don't know. That's my guess.
Sure.
It's like a snort noise. I don't know.
Rich people finding out the circle of life. It's the circle.
Yeah. We showed rich people The Lion King.
Oh my god. Oh, I love it.
You won't believe their response.
Better when they find the circle of death, though. True, Muta. Thank you as well, Muta, for the Patreon appreciation. Much respect and appreciation. Excuse me. When one perceives humanity to be something separate from nature, it becomes easier to regard landscapes in their natural state as landscapes without human inhabitants and aspire to preserve wilderness by encouraging the existence and survival in landscape of as many species as possible, minus one. Humans!
Human.
It's a South Park joke.
Ferengi are part of nature.
There's this South Park joke of like this Terminator character who goes back in time, so he's a robot. And anyways, without to get into too much details of the episode, he needs to disguise the fact that he's a robot from everyone. So like he keeps on doing things like, I have to play human tennis. I mean tennis. Human.
The Ferengi also say human. Although I think they dropped that like halfway through DS9. I don't really know why.
I wonder if that's where the South Park writers got it from.
There's a Gulliver's Travels fandom site. Sure, whatever. Okay.
The Houyhnhnms are an equine race and are described as a highly intelligent society of what appear at first glance to be ordinary horses. They coexist to a certain extent with a savage human-like race called Yahoos on an island known as Houyhnhnm Land, located off the southern coast of Australia. Well, there you go. Speaking of Yahoos, cheesecake for everyone. Cheesecake. Yahoo Nation. All right.
There's no way Gulliver's Travels was written when Australia was discovered. 1726. When the fuck was Australia discovered?
Muta became a Patreon because they just wanted Discord clout. Well, now you have it.
That makes sense.
Congratulations. All right. The valuable contribution anthropology has made to conservation is perhaps best expressed by Paige West and Dan Brockington, who advise conservationists to be more aware of local ways of seeing, and that the practice of conservation will be more successful if practitioners learn local idioms for understanding people's surroundings before they begin to think about things in terms of nature and culture. There is a need, they say, for conservationists to grasp the complicated ways that people interact with what they rely on for food, shelter, as well as spiritual, social, and economic needs. You would think that, like, you wouldn't need to be taught this. But I guess so. Maybe for the same reason that rich person didn't realize that he was also a part of nature.
I don't know, like, think about how necessary it is for most people who go about their daily existence to think about where most of the stuff that they have comes from. Like, it's kind of, it's the whole, like, you talking about, like, phone being part of you. Like,
Yeah.
How often do people who pick up their phones think of, like, where the pieces of that came from? Let alone, their cereal or their milk or whatever. Like, they might know abstractly that, like, oh yeah, milk come from cow. Have they been to a dairy farm? It's...
No, and I realize, like, maybe it's just a product of my brain, which is that, like, I realize that there's a lot of intersecting and interacting forces in the world that we should consider if we're going to study a thing. And it just, like, in this context, he's talking about the other people who are studying a thing, in particular, how to conserve something, or I guess even whether we should conserve or not conserve or whatever. you would think that that would enter into their thoughts of like what does conservation consist of. I guess this is part of what this article is about, is that a lot of these conservationists didn't even fucking consider anything. They were just like, how do we just have the trees there so that we can look at them?
Yeah. Like, yeah. Yeah. It's
Like,
just
I don't
like,
even know. I don't know if the article is going to get into it, but there was the one like old conservation tale about, I think it was shit, what's the name of the park? It's the one where there's like a super active volcano underneath
Yellowstone?
Yellowstone, where they like initially like killed all the wolves, and then because they killed all the wolves, like some of the other animal populations started to soar, so they had to
Yeah.
reintroduce wolves to like balance it out, because they were just like, we want a park without wolves. And then realized that like that caused
it took
damage.
them a very long time because it was like it got to the point where like Yellowstone was experiencing trophic cascade. Like it's, you remove something integral and then like the deer population explodes
Yeah.
and then plummets after they eat all the food, and then the plants that the deer used to eat and the beavers and the whoever else, is around also like start to act differently because the main species that like control that environment are gone. And so like introducing wolves, like they did that like way too late. Also, side note, did you hear about that wolf that made it all the way to California
No.
from, I think, an Oregon um pack? And it walked like, and it was the first wolf to be in California in like more than a century, and it got hit by a car.
Oh.
Yeah.
The thing, this is like part of the issue of like, again, thinking about the like, part of the reason why these things are bad in our current context is the fact that we have taken over so much of the planet that we're limiting the sort of like range of these species in various ways, like through habitat loss. And this is having a devastating effect on biodiversity at large, let alone in like particular ecosystems, right? Such as, if you want to call it an ecosystem, because I already pointed out that it's a complicated term, but like the fact of like the ecosystem of Yellowstone, right?
Yeah.
But then the other part of me is like, it's weird, like in a vacuum, like throughout all of like the existence of creatures on this planet, you would have die-offs and changes in the natural environment. The quote unquote natural environment will shift as like species change and die off, or grow, overpopulate, etc., etc., right? And the thing is, then that causes other changes to happen, etc., etc. And so like there's a question that I always come back to with conservation, which is like, is there a point in like perpetually keeping the same dynamic, or even like artificially somehow keeping a same dynamic that is better than like not artificially keeping it? And some of the arguments like fall weak to me, which is like, I don't know, sometimes things are going to change. Does that make it a better or worse thing? I mean, it'll only become worse as if in the process we as humans end up killing off all the species, That's bad.
I mean,
I think.
like it depends on how much you want to abstract it, I guess, from human existence as well, because it's like, I mean, for the most part, we need these other like functioning as they historically did ecosystems in order to, exist on this planet in a lot of ways. And it's like a question of like, oh, do we want that to continue? Because it's like, yeah, like, okay, sure. Oh, all the wolves are gone in Yellowstone, might as well just like adjust to the new situation. But it's like, okay, then when Yellowstone dies and the rivers start drying up and like everything else starts happening, it's like, oh, like, oh, maybe those things were necessary for human habitation in that area as well. because we're part of these ecosystems.
Well,
Like,
it also matters like to what extent these various things are resilient in ways. Like, does this cascade of like species die off in this particular area necessitate like the rivers drying up or like whatever?
yeah, like
Uh,
it's
or
the
it
same with
can,
like
but then like
beavers,
yeah,
where like the removal of beavers has hugely fucked up waterways on the eastern part of this continent. Like,
well yeah, and fucked ups
rivers
in
used to flow
particular
less.
ways. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like, and it's like okay, you can be like, okay, well, the beavers are gone, so we just gotta adjust or whatever, and it's like, or we can just reintroduce them and make the world more habitable for multi-species, like, interactions, like, and then also, like, have
Ooh.
healthier waterways that we don't have to wait however long it will be for something else to evolve to fill that niche. Like,
Yeah,
it's one of those like, yeah, like eventually something will fill its spot, but it's like, okay, do we want to wait that long?
no, and I think like what you're getting at least for me is like this is like we should have been thinking about these things in less in terms of conservation in terms of these parks and more just how we develop our cities and even like rural areas and taking into consideration the kind of like biodiversity and ecosystems that we need in these areas to live in these areas and sustain in these areas, right? Where it's like it feels weird to me in particular with like the idea of conservation and like parks, where it's like it feels like it's being done just for the sake of like preserving some sort of like again like idyllic situation where everything remains the same, that we're going to make sure that it stays in this state forever and never changes, but not for the benefits that we're talking about. It's more just for the benefits so that like people can come and see some wolves in a park, or see some trees in a park.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that, for the wolf thing especially, like, originally, no, they didn't want to see wolves in the park.
Yeah.
And they realized that when you remove them, it hugely fucks up their own, like, shitty efforts at conservation, because it's basically impossible to, quote unquote, conserve the parkland without wolves present because of how important they are to the ecosystem as they so colonially enjoyed it. And so, they got to reintroduce the wolves. So in some respects, I think that that's them more like actually learning and
Yeah,
is
I
like
mean,
at least a moderate reform in the right. It's a social democracy of, you know, forest management and land management, but
you see that in a lot of like our northern parks as well, where they're beginning to actually do like forest maintenance and stuff like this, which is what the indigenous communities before were doing.
yeah, yeah, controlled burns and everything like that. And those are coming back in Australia in a big way too. Or I don't know about a big way, but I've read some articles about it.
Enrique Salmon believes that language and thought works together, so when people's language includes a word like wilderness, that shapes their thoughts about the relationship to the natural world. The notion of wilderness then carries the notion that humans are bad for the environment. Certainly, someone who regards the forest as his pantry is going to see the flora, fauna, soil, and water in a somewhat different light than the tourist. It's ironic. This is kind of getting exactly what I was talking about. It happens all the time. Different light than the tourist, biologist, miner, or logger. But is there not something that can be seen by all of them? Some common ground on which the forest's intrinsic value can be considered and agreed upon? One example of a very different local idiom that Western naturalists have difficulty understanding is that of the Gimi, one of the hundreds of remote Stone Age cultures in central Papua New Guinea. The Gimi have no notion of nature or culture, says Weston Brockington. They see themselves in an ongoing set of exchanges with their ancestors, who they believe are animating and residing in their forests, infusing animals, plants, rivers, and the land itself with life. When people die, their spirits go back to the forest and infuse themselves into plants, animals, and rivers. When the living use these natural resources, they do not see it as a depletion, but rather as an ongoing exchange of energy and spirit. When the Gimi kill and eat an animal, they understand it to be generated by their ancestors' life forces, and it will work to make their life force during this lifetime. When they die, that force will go back to the forest and replenish it. This is an admittedly difficult cosmology for the Western mind to contemplate or accept.
It's funny because like that's just basic like physics, basically.
Yeah, I was gonna say like, I mean, like I don't find it hard to contemplate or accept, but I'm also
Yeah.
definitely more of a holistic thinker, which I think is what this is getting at. And I do think that it kind of like that sort of holistic thinking does cut against the kind of like neoliberal individualistic sentiment of a lot of Westerners.
Yeah.
But the fact that every atom in every living thing has existed since the beginning of time gives some scientific grounding to the Gimi's belief that spirit is simply reorganized force and matter. Yeah. That said, their understanding of the relationship between humans and their surroundings remains extremely difficult to reconcile with arguments about the decline and loss of biological diversity. However, if Western conservationists in central Papua New Guinea know that the Gimi believe all matter is here for eternity, that it simply changes form over time, they will be better equipped to work with local communities in the preservation of biodiversity. But if they dismiss that cosmology as primitive animism and seek to impose Western science and religion on the Gimi people, their conservation initiative will almost certainly fail. Of course, the final arbiters in the scientific conflict should be indigenous peoples themselves, the very people that early advocates for Yellowstone Park said had no interest in raw nature or the park area. They were alleged to be afraid of the geysers and fumaroles. Not true, they cooked over them. The truth is that
I want to do that so bad.
The truth is that much of what the rest of us know about nature and have incorporated into the various sciences we use to protect it, ecology, zoology, botany, ethnobotany, we learn from the very people we have expelled from the areas we have sought to protect. That kind of reminds me of, I know Jared Diamond is particularly problematic for a lot of his stuff, but he, in one of his books, I can't remember which one it was, I want to say it was Collapse, he tells this anecdote about Easter Island, which had this idea of like how the, like, you know, the heads on Easter Island?
Yeah.
And the question is like, how were they erected, right? Like, what was the process? And you had a bunch of like Western scientists come in there and like trying to fiddle with shit, like various forms of levers and pulleys to do this shit, to be like, how? And then it was like, well, then how did they even come up with these like levers and pulley systems and like all this like shit, right?
Yeah.
And all it took was finally one of the scientists turned to one of the indigenous people who were all just watching these people do it and was like, how would you do it? And then the guy was, the indigenous person was like, well, let us show you. And they just like started like putting like rocks on the ground, and then you would stick like a piece of wood in and like lift it slightly, stuff more rocks in, and then just keep doing that until it like leveled itself up.
Hello, my rebels. Hello, my rebels. I'm a good boy. I'm a weirdo.